The Egyptian soldiers on the east bank of the Suez Canal were not protected by courage alone. Behind them, across the water on the west bank, stood one of the most important unseen structures of the October War, a layered shield of missiles, radar, guns, cables, generators, command posts, and trained crews. It did not look like a wall from the air, and it did not appear on the desert floor as a single dramatic object. Yet for Israeli pilots and tank crews, it changed the war almost immediately. The missile umbrella was the reason Egypt's first bridgeheads did not vanish under the familiar combination of Israeli air attack and armored counterstroke. It turned the canal front into a new kind of battlefield, one where movement, survival, and confidence were governed by systems as much as by bravery. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. In 1967, Israeli air power had been one of the decisive facts of the war. Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground, Israeli pilots ranged widely, and Arab ground forces often fought under the shadow of sudden attack from above. That memory shaped Israeli expectations in the years that followed. If Egypt crossed the canal, many assumed the Israeli Air Force would help tear the crossing apart while armored reserves raced forward from the desert. But Egypt had spent years studying that very assumption. It understood that soldiers in boats, engineers at the sand wall, and tanks waiting for bridges would be terribly vulnerable if Israeli aircraft could strike freely. So the canal plan was built not only around getting across the water, but around making the sky above the crossing dangerous enough to slow Israel's response. The umbrella was not a single missile battery with a heroic reputation. It was a network. Long-range and medium-range surface-to-air missiles guarded different layers of the airspace. Anti-aircraft guns filled lower gaps. Radar watched for incoming aircraft, while command systems passed warnings and orders. Some weapons were older and more familiar, while others were mobile enough to move forward and complicate Israeli planning. To a listener without a map, imagine the canal as a long north-south line, with the Egyptian army on the west side building a protective roof that extended over the water and partway into Sinai. Egyptian infantry could cross into that covered zone, dig in, and know that Israeli aircraft faced a much more dangerous approach than they had in the last war. That protection did not make the Egyptians invulnerable. No air defense system does. Radars can be jammed, launchers can be attacked, crews can be killed, ammunition can run low, and pilots can adapt. But in war, a system does not have to be perfect to be decisive. It only has to impose enough cost, delay, and uncertainty to change enemy behavior. During the opening days, Israeli aircraft could not simply sweep in and dismantle the bridgeheads at will. Pilots had to think about missile envelopes, approach routes, altitude, timing, and the danger of flying into a layered trap. Every moment spent avoiding missiles was a moment not spent freely supporting the tanks near the canal. The sky, which Israel had often used as an open road, had become contested ground. On the east bank, Egyptian infantry carried the other half of the shock. Anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless rifles, and other weapons were distributed in ways that turned the bridgeheads into bristling defensive nests. The best known of these weapons was the Soviet-made Sagar, a guided missile that allowed infantry to hit tanks from beyond the reach of a simple thrown explosive or close assault weapon. It was not magic, and it required training, nerve, and a clear enough view of the target. But against tanks advancing too quickly, without infantry properly clearing the ground, it could be devastating. The Israeli crews who drove toward the canal expected danger, but many did not expect infantry to reach out across the desert with such accuracy and patience. The effect on Israeli armor was psychological as well as physical. A tank gives its crew a feeling of mass and power, but it is also a confined steel room with limited vision. When missiles begin flying from positions that are hard to see, that feeling changes. A crew may know the enemy is somewhere ahead, low in the sand, perhaps near a ditch or embankment, but not know exactly where to aim. Smoke, dust, artillery bursts, and broken communications make the uncertainty worse. Some tanks were hit. Others halted, maneuvered, or fired at suspected positions. The rhythm of the counterattacks slowed. That slowing was precisely what Egypt needed. The bridgeheads did not have to destroy every Israeli tank. They had to prevent Israeli armor from arriving like a clean blade at the water's edge. This was the collision between two different kinds of doctrine. Israeli armored warfare prized initiative, speed, aggressive junior commanders, and the ability to recover from surprise by striking quickly. Those qualities had real value, and they would matter later in the war. But in the first days, they were being used against a defensive system designed to punish exposed movement. Egypt's doctrine near the canal was more deliberate. Infantry would hold ground. Anti-tank teams would wait for Israeli armor. Artillery would strike approach routes. Air defenses would make air support costly. Tanks would reinforce the bridgeheads rather than rush beyond them at once. It was less glamorous than a sweeping armored breakthrough, but it was well suited to the limited war Sadat had chosen. The umbrella also shows why modern combined arms warfare is not simply a matter of adding more machines to the battlefield. It is a matter of connecting them. A missile battery without radar is partly blind. Radar without disciplined crews is a warning without a hand to act on it. Infantry with anti-tank weapons but no artillery or supply may be brave and still be overrun. Tanks without infantry and air support may be powerful and still be led into a killing zone. Egypt's opening success came from arranging these parts so that each protected the others. The air defenses protected the bridgeheads from above. The infantry protected the bridgeheads from Israeli tanks. The engineers kept the crossing alive. The artillery added weight and disruption. The whole was more dangerous than any single weapon inside it. For Israeli commanders, the first encounters with this system were disorienting because they seemed to attack the very habits that had made Israel strong. When armor moved forward, it met anti-tank fire. When aircraft tried to intervene, they met missiles and guns. When forward strongpoints called for help, the routes to them were no longer clean. The battlefield seemed to resist the old remedy at every level. This did not mean Israeli leaders were incapable of learning. Quite the opposite. The later Israeli recovery depended on adaptation, improvisation, and a willingness to find seams in the Egyptian system. But learning under fire is costly. The first lessons were paid for by crews and pilots who discovered that the canal front of 1973 was not the open killing ground of 1967. There was, however, a boundary to Egypt's shield, and that boundary would become one of the most important facts of the campaign. The missile umbrella was strongest close to the canal, where the crossing plan had placed it. The farther Egyptian armor moved eastward into Sinai, the harder it became to keep the same dense protection overhead and around the advancing troops. The protective system had depth, but not endless depth. It was built to support the limited objective: cross, seize bridgeheads, and hold them against counterattack. This is why the later Egyptian decision to push armor beyond the propelled zone would carry such risk. A tank force that leaves its supporting system behind does not merely move into open ground, it moves into a different war. From the Israeli perspective, that limitation offered hope. If the Egyptian system could not be smashed immediately at the canal, perhaps it could be drawn, stretched, bypassed, or attacked at its edges. Israeli commanders began to look for places where the Egyptian armies did not connect perfectly, where air defenses were thinner, where armor could maneuver beyond the thickest anti-tank zones, and where bold movement might restore operational initiative. This search would eventually lead toward Dever and the gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. But in the early days, that future was not yet visible to the soldiers under fire. What was visible was a battlefield that had suddenly become hostile to every familiar Israeli answer. The umbrella had bought Egypt something priceless: time. For Egypt, the missile umbrella was a triumph of preparation, but it also carried a quiet danger of its own. Systems that work well can encourage leaders to forget the conditions that make them work. The canal bridgeheads were strong because they were connected to artillery, air defense, supplies, engineers, and infantry positions. They were not proof that Egyptian armor could roam anywhere in Sinai on equal terms. This distinction may sound technical, but it is central to the tragedy and drama of the campaign. The same system that gave Egypt its opening victory also defined the limits of that victory. To remain under the umbrella was to preserve strength. To move beyond it was to gamble that momentum could replace protection. Modern armored warfare rarely forgives that kind of confusion for long. The men inside this system experienced it not as theory, but as pressure. Egyptian missile crews waited beside launchers and radar screens, knowing that a failure to act might leave their infantry exposed. Anti-tank teams lay in prepared positions, watching for the shape of Israeli armor through dust and smoke. Israeli pilots flew into airspace where warning tones, missile trails, and sudden explosions forced split-second decisions. Israeli tank crews scanned the ground for enemies who could kill them from positions that looked empty until the moment of firing. None of these men were fighting a clean duel. They were caught inside an interlocking machine of observation, concealment, fire, and fear. That is what made the opening of the October War feel so different from the stories both sides had carried into it. Under the missile umbrella, the tank was still central, but it was no longer sovereign. Egypt had shown that armor could be checked by infantry missiles, that aircraft could be pushed back by ground-based air defenses, and that a carefully prepared bridgehead could survive the first violent hours against a faster opponent. Israel would later adapt, recover, and exploit the limits of the Egyptian system with great skill, but the lesson of the opening days could not be erased. The Canal Front marked a turning point in the modern understanding of armored battle. Tanks did not disappear, and air power did not cease to matter. What changed was the certainty that speed and shock could solve every problem. In the shadow of the canal's missile umbrella, modern war revealed itself as a contest of systems, and the side that ignored that truth paid in burning vehicles, falling aircraft, and broken assumptions.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.